Good afternoon, Airsofters. I had a spur-of-the-moment idea where I figured, since I have 15 years of experience in Airsoft, as surprising as it is to myself, that with my collection of everything I've tried, I figure I could make a little intro video series for any new Airsofters going to Bing or maybe the new GG Sports Park over in Wentzville. Just if you're getting into Airsoft, what do you want to be looking for so that you're not overspending on things that probably are wasteful? It's very easy to do in this sport because with Airsoft, there's a lot of role playing that people can pay extra to have, or there's a lot of parts that are out there on the market. It's like, well, what do I want to upgrade on my gun? Well, let's just keep it simple with starting with how am I going to get into it? What role do I want to play? And what little upgrades can optimize your experience for, say, even 10 years of playing? Honestly, there's just minute details that you'll notice in every game that actually matter versus a little fluff on top of your hobby. So, as far as getting started, I'd say the biggest things you have to start off with is you're going to need some sort of face protection so that your pearly whites in your eyes are going to be safe. So when you're looking at face protection, you have to imagine you're on the field, you're playing, you have your airsoft gun, and you want to make sure you're hitting the target. Well, that can be kind of difficult whenever you're wearing one of the paintball masks because you're really relying on the fact that you cannot cheek rest the gun and view down sights, and you're more or less just watching the BBs travel to the target because there's some bright color. Now, some of the Bing BBs, like the purple 28s, those are incredibly difficult to see all the way to target. So you want to try to pick up BB that's going to be a pretty bright color and easy to see. Because getting into the sport, you're going to be working with the basics. So whenever you can work your way into it, these helmets that you're going to see a lot of people wearing, they're actually not that expensive. This is basically a bicycle helmet with a camo pattern thrown right on top of it. So this is called a fast style helmet, and currently I have a face mask connected to it with a little Vulcan kit that you can get for like $9 or something like that. I get all my stuff from Evite for the most part, just because if something doesn't fit, I can just return it straight to them. And if stuff's going to break, well, that's just because Airsoft quality is usually not up to par. That's something you're going to have to get used to. It's a lot of stuff's going to rip, tear apart, maybe last you a few years, and then replace it. Even Fish's face mask, this whole area here starts to rust. And then he's getting rust face every time he takes it off at the end of the day. It's pretty funny, but either way, the nice thing about this is that the padding on the side here versus the hard plastic on this sucker is you can actually cheek rest onto the rifle, aim down, and take your shots. So whenever you can get to the stage that you can skip the paintball mask and go straight to a nice face protector and helmet style, that way you can take precise shots every time. That's always a big plus. With the goggles that you have to go with the helmet, because paintball mask, yeah, you got a built-in setup, so that's pretty obvious. But with goggles, this is where I say figuring out a good pair for the dollar, I don't think it's really achievable. I've tried many sorts of entry goggles for the sake of trying to find a pair that I can play for a match and not fog up. Be able to stay in the play and not be squinting through my own goggles trying to tell what I'm shooting. And at the end of the day, this is probably the best entry dollar setup that I've found. It's a Vulcan pair of goggles that go for $60 at the Bing shop. And they have a thermal kind of dual pane setup along with a silicone anti-fog that have so far I'm able to play a match without fogging. Now, granted, it doesn't stop me from sweating into my eyes, and you have to wipe that out. I mean, that's just down to you how much you sweat when you're running around. But for anti-fog a whole match and not having to be that guy in a corner like, hold on, don't shoot me, let me get this wiped away. No, that's not fun. You want to be in the fight the whole time. Now, if you have a little extra funds, I'm not going to say get this specific goggles, but think about your finger protection. Whenever you're aiming down and you have all these fingers out here, the first thing that the enemy sees when you're poking a corner, cover them up. Get some sort of finger guards, like mechanics sells gloves on the regular that are called their Impact Series, and those will work wonders for having an extra rubber pad so that if that BB hits your knuckles, you're not going to be bleeding all the time. That's the worst place to get shot is on the knuckles, so cover them up. Now that you got your gear kind of sorted out, because that's all you need for your intro, just protect your face, have good eye seal protection that you can see out of the whole game without fighting that, protect your knuckles. Now you just need to pick out a gun. Now, most entry setups, you either say, am I going to be a spring guy, or am I going to be an AEG, which is an automatic electric gearbox. Now, with the spring setups, they're incredibly cheap. You can get, this L96, you can get it from Well for about 90 to 100 bucks in most cases. However, it's coming with internals that aren't well sealed, a hop-up that's not necessarily great for shooting past 120 feet, where you're going to be outgunned by most stock automatic guns such as this. Going to be really cool to have your nice scope and bolt action. It's not recommended as an entry-level airsofter. I'd say to have this as it is with the Action Army upgrades, I'm roughly 600 to 700 invested in this rifle. So that's why I don't recommend that for entry players. That's something that you're going to, as time progresses, decide if you want to upgrade your AEG or upgrade the bolt action. But I'm at a stage that after 15 years, I would say for airsoft where you want to go on a weekend and get some shots in, and you don't want to be spending your time just sitting in a bush waiting for a perfect shot. 5 minutes pass by. Oh, maybe I got a shot? Okay, I'm a sight in. Oh, he's hiding again. Okay, let's try this guy. Okay, it's a great shot. I take the shot, hits a twig right in front of my barrel, and it ruins the whole shot. I'd say for the sake of getting the most fun out of a day of play, I'm always going to recommend the Assault class. Now, the Assault class is anything that's 400 feet per second and lower with a .20 gram BB. That is a common rule across most fields ever, with the exception of indoors. But I'm going to refer to outdoor play at Bing Field for the most part here because that's where my blood runs. So you have your automatic electric gearbox based airsoft gun. Now, with these, you can easily overspend on body components that are licensed by real steel manufacturers, and by real steel that means an actual firearm manufacturer. So I'm always going to recommend that on the entry level, look at either a G&G combat machine or a GMP, they don't really have model series names, but roughly you want to look at what is a full metal receiver, which that is this portion of the gun, full metal receiver with a GMP gearbox if you're willing to spend that extra dollar for an absolute tank. The DMR that I'm running is an entry-level GMP internal gearbox with metal receiver that all I've done to that gun is change out the spring for a better feet per second and a different hop-up setup. That's it. Nothing fancy about it. It's just a long barrel with a good hop-up and a tried and true tanky GMP gearbox. That is completely stock. There's no gears, with the exception of, now that I remember, it does have a full metal piston. But we don't need to get into that for this video. Again, with the AEG, that's just straight out the box, you will get more hits in a game than you could probably get in a bolt action for an entire season of play. Just because with this AEG, you're running up the field, you're taking objectives, you're on the front lines. It doesn't matter if you miss that one shot because you can just follow up with a few more right behind it. Super easy. And it doesn't take a high-end airsoft rifle to make that happen. So that's where I really recommend for most airsoft players that are brand new to the sport, look at a G&G combat machine, even with a polymer body, and just rock that. Just start running around and make it work. It may not have the best range out the box with a basic hop-up, because I can kind of show that. This is what a G&G will give you straight out the box. It's just a polymer hop-up chamber, not necessarily the best seal in the world, but it will still get you shots up to about 100, 120 feet. That's not a strong issue for it. The GMPs that I was referencing, they'll get you the metal hop-up with a nice seal on the end of the chamber, but it's still just a basic hop-up unit where your adjustment dial is still not very precise. Usually a rotary dial is a lot friendlier for airsoft users, especially when you're trying to adjust on the fly mid-game. This wheel can tend to be really, really stiff to adjust, and it's hard to track where you were. So don't focus necessarily on that for your entry gun. And then the last thing you need for your basic kit is battery and charger, because that's the name of the game. Now, what most people call LiPos, lithium polymer-based batteries, you have to focus on what's going to fit inside of your airsoft gun, because different airsoft guns are going to have different storage compartments. Some of the Vietnam-looking M4s, they're going to have a front-loaded battery inside of the casing, and those will have usually a small Tamiya-style connector. That would be... This is a small Tamiya, as you can see. This is the big Tamiya. Now with GMPs, they almost always come standard with a Dean's connector, which is better for current draw, less restrictive connector style. Hence, this is the GMP Phantom that I haven't featured on the channel in a while, just because I've rather butchered it over time. All the testing with DSG components. Now, you'll notice, why do I have this just hanging out here in a pouch? That's because there's no room inside of the original buffer tube for a big boy battery. And for DSG life, I've had to have that in order to power the system. This is super stiff spring. But for most entry-level airsoft guns, you can pick up these little 1100 milliamp hour batteries that are 15C discharge rate, and that 11-1 style will typically do most airsoft guns. If you find that the gearbox is overspinning, where you pull the trigger once and it accidentally fires 2 shots, then this may still be too powerful for your airsoft gun. That's where you would step down from the 11.1 volt to a 7.4 volt lithium ion. Sorry, not lithium polymer. And both lithium ion and lithium polymer are charged with a standard charger. This one's by 10 Energy. You don't have to buy an airsoft specific charger, it's just batteries. And each of these lithium setups, they have a balance plug and a main power plug. Now with charging these, you always have to make sure you use a charger that has a built-in balancing for the multi-cells. 11.1 volt is a stack of 3 battery cells. A 7.4 volt is a stack of 2 battery cells that go from a 4.1 volts full to 3.7 volts whenever you should stop using them. You don't want to overdrain these. You can't drain these to dead. That's very bad for the batteries, and you'll risk a fire hazard whenever you go to charge them the next time. So usually whenever you notice the fire rate starting to slow down, stop using the battery, swap it out for another one. So I think this is probably the biggest cost you're going to have of an entry-level airsoft setup, is having enough batteries to play a day without having to recharge. So I would say each of these batteries can get you about 2 to 3 hours of play. So if you're going to do a 10 to 5 day of gaming, you can probably get away with 2 11.1 volts that are 1100 milliamp hour. Maybe a third, but I haven't done that yet with the DMR. Usually 2 batteries, I'm good for an entire day. Alright, so in the previous part, I was talking about what you want to be looking at into starting off airsoft, with just the basic entry and such. Now, for this next segment, let's say you're in airsoft, you had fun in your first matches, and now you're curious about, okay, there's all these ways to tune my airsoft setup in order to perform better on the field, so I feel like I can actually take down the critical targets without having to kind of spray and pray. So to get more into that with the AEG setup, what you have going on is you have in the M4s is a version 2 gearbox. The version 2.5, I'm fairly certain, is an extended one that's longer to work with the larger mag size of the SR25 styles. V3s, I think, are 8Ks. And then you have ICS, which will make their own dedicated split gearbox where they have the gearbox in 2 halves. So I'm going to steer this entirely towards you have gone with the basic setup of an M4 with a version 2 gearbox and what you want to do in order to do some improvements on it. Now, as I said in the first part, I highly recommended starting with your first setup to be just a basic, say, G&G combat machine and just enjoy the sport. Now, let's say you really want to get into things. That's where I say if you're going to upgrade a rifle, you need to be able to be upgrading a rifle that is easy to service. And what I mean by that is a lot of the generic polymer body styles, they wear very quickly. They can crack easy from stresses, and even with learn with poor Fish's green combat machine, if you stub the barrel into the dirt, it can bend the entire assembly up front and bend your inner barrel. So very prone to damage. So if you're going to get a rifle you want to service and work on, find one that has a all metal receiver. Whether it's G&P, Crytek, G&G, VFCs, Avalon series, your kind of choice on that one. Choose a reputable brand that has a good history behind them and go for an all metal setup. And then from there, there's not a whole lot I'm really going to recommend for you to do. So the most important thing is your hop up. So where we said G&G came with a lot of polymer style hop up chambers that aren't necessarily the best fit inside of most setups. And then G&P gave you a metal setup, but it's still this real rudimentary, not so easy to adjust dial system. And typically the way that these C-clips are locked in, very, very difficult to undo, tune, and put back together. So my recommendation is you can look at either SHS, Prometheus, or even the Max hop-up is kind of an expensive option. But the idea is a rotary dial setup. So this rotary dial, you can tune it either way so that you can apply pressure using a hop-up arm that's riding inside of the dial, which as you twist it, will go in and out. Now, granted, I have some M-nub on this hop-up arm. I didn't have a raw arm to really give an example. But the idea is it's pushing on the top side of the bucking into the barrel and applying pressure to put backspin on your beauties. So even then, there are a million different bucking combos for sale right now. You'll probably usually hear Prometheus purples, Mad Bull reds, Mad Bull blues, G&G greens. My go-to for just any build that I work on is going to be Maple Leaf, or their main manufacturer known, if you're looking at e-bike, is Airsoft Taiwan, AST. So you have the AST Maple Leaf buckings, and they have different what they call degrees of buckings, which you could have a 50 degree, I think a 60, a 70, a 75, and an 80. Now those are each for their own FPS ratings. If you go too soft, it's going to wear out very quickly, but it'll have good grip onto a slick BB and make sure you get a good backspin every time. The harder ones that are, say, 80 degree are meant for higher FPS, so they can still apply grip to the BB at that velocity. But I still think, and most would probably recommend a similar, that a 70 degree bucking by Maple Leaf is the most usable bucking for all applications. It's hardly any situation that bucking will not work. Now, you may hear options of R-hop or ER hop, flat hop, and such, but typically the macaron bucking by Maple Leaf, Airsoft Taiwan, along with the Omega tensioner, which is effectively a plastic piece that goes where your old nub used to be, is the best entry-level combo I can recommend for any setup. You can possibly get it to load into one of these, because the hop-up arms in here can work with the same setup as this, as well as the buckings. They're just harder to work with. So having a hop-up chamber that you can put in a maple leaf omega nub and maple leaf macaron bucking, those are the go-to setups for an entry setup. Now, for stainless steel versus a brass barrel, typically you don't need to really make that upgrade. In all honesty, the newer setups are very, very well made to the barrel being nice and true. That's more important than a stainless steel inner diameter change. So whereas a stock is typically a 605 or a 608 millimeter inner diameter, where your BBs are usually a 5.99, so that would be 0.06 mil clearance on standard barrels most times. The nice thing about that is if the barrel shakes, it's not going to slap the BB around as it's heading out, and it's not going to mess up your trajectory. So they're very nice for that. Meanwhile, stainless steels, like the most common one is the Prometheus 603 in a barrel stainless steel. They have the reputation of having a nice true inner diameter while reducing the inner diameter so that your air can be more efficient in propelling the BB out. So you can get a tidbit more FPS for the springs that you're using. I mean, it's not mind-blowing amount, but like I might vouch saying you get 5 FPS going from a 605 to a 603. It's little bits that you're just trying to fine-tune. But the biggest thing is that the stock hop-up bucking and nub combo does not apply nearly as well of a backspin on the BB as you can get out of the Omega tensioner and the macaron bucking. So I highly recommend that. It always does the most bang for buck performance out of the box compared to anything else you can do to your rifle. You'll go from a stock setup of shooting maybe 75 to 100 feet to shooting happily at 150 feet, and you'll be really impressed by the difference of making that little change. Now, the thing to be careful about though is the way this is set up. This hop-up chamber is pressing against the nozzle and the gearbox, and it has to sit all the way inside of your setup. Some hop-up chambers, this rectangular section up top, can interfere with the front receiver it seats into. So you have to make sure that there's no interference when you load it in, and you have that same strong spring effect, whether it be with O-ring stacks or even eraser nubs, whatever you can do to keep this shoved up against the gearbox. Because once it slaps forward in any amount, you're going to have trouble with loading your magazines, you're going to have trouble with air seals as the nozzle's firing. You may even find that with certain hop-up chambers, your stock nozzle length is no longer long enough to reach the bucking and create an air seal against it. Because you have this lip, and those need to just seat against each other so that all the air goes down the barrel. If you don't have that, it's not going to work. I have actually experienced on the DMR that I use with the American flag design on it, the stock screw going into the spring guide inside of the gearbox, anchoring that down was pulling the gearbox back, and it was pulling my nozzle out of the bucking. A longer nozzle would have helped that, but we ended up taking some rubber sorbo pads and basically acting as washer spacers on the backside to keep the gearbox from pulling out of the hop-up chamber. And that can cause significant FPS drops. I'm talking well over 100 FPS loss if you do not have a proper seal between the nozzle and the bucking. So that's hop-up in summary right there. Next thing going in is going to be the motor. Now, most stock setups are going to use what they call a ferrite magnet-based motor, not a rare earth metal, neodymium, I think it's pronounced. It's neomagnet motors is the nickname. I believe this M140 is just a really strong iron setup, ferrous magnet. Now, there are upgraded versions you have. Sometimes dealers sell them as far as TPA, or the strength of the motor. That's the number of coil lines you have to produce torque out of it. Now, like say a 22 TPA is the highest torque you typically see out of an airsoft motor on the market. So it'll have a real quick turn speed, so you can turn a gear set and get a real instant response out of the gear set, but you won't get as much rate of fire. So like typically, like with this blue gun, I always used I think it's roughly an 18 to 22 TPA setups, and those would achieve about 25 rounds per second on an 18 to 1 gear set. It wasn't too much different with the 20 to 1 gear set either. So roughly if you used an 18 to 22 TPA, you are going to get roughly 25 rounds a second, pretty steadily. And also very snappy response. It's very nice to have that. You don't want to peek a corner and wait for the gun to spool up to get your shot out. So that's where you can go to a 13 to 1 gear set, which is the number of revolutions for the gear set to turn before it fires the piston. However, that's a lot more wear on your motor, where it's semi-auto, even with a 25 RPS setup, I would go through a motor, I want to say almost semi-annually or annually, depending on the motor, just because having to start the motor and stop, start the motor and stop, kills them up. They do not last long on that setup. So you're having to do a lot of tuning to readjust a motor to each gearbox, because the engagement of these teeth is critical for wear, or else you're going to strip teeth. So that's just a thing you have to deal with airsoft electric gearbox stuff. HPA is nice that you can just blink, 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 and you don't have to worry about wearing that out. But motors you will have to change out regularly with a electric gearbox and potentially gear sets. Particularly the one that's going to get all the wear is the first gear that gets hit by the motor, the bevel gear. So this one right here, where these intersect, if you ever hear your gear strip, it's likely this guy. Don't lose my bushings and washers. Yeah, these gears are shimmed as delivered to give you a nice minimal resistance, but anytime you load a new gear set, you will have to get these properly shimmed. There are tutorials out there for shimming it. It's just making sure that your teeth are not press fit against each other where they're mashed together by force. They need to just do the bypassing torque, and that's it. So if you ever hear a gearbox that's squealing like a pig, they've got their shims too tight. If it's got a grinding noise like teeth are slipping, they've got it too loose. I'm not going to dive into that. I'm just going to point out that if you have to replace motors, you have to make sure that the motor height set screw is set so that it's properly engaged with the bevel screw. The cheater way to do it is to engage the motor with the set screw until it comes to a stop. Don't crank it, and then back it off, say a quarter to a half turn. Just back it off enough so that it's come to stop, a little off, and then that typically gets you close enough. Because the proper way to do it is a much more tedious, where you're shimming the bevel gear to get the height engagement with the motor proper. You'll get more life out of that, but that's something that even I have difficulty getting that height correctly with how a gearbox shell is set up, because you don't have much visibility into the teeth engagement with the gearbox shell closed. A sight window would probably help a lot with that, but the gearboxes that I have had typically don't have sight windows to see how they mesh and what motor height or shim height is needed to get that perfect. So the easy way to go about it is leave the original shimming from the original gun alone, and then just adjust the motor height to come on in, stop, and then just back off a quarter to half turn on your motor set screw. If you need to super glue that set screw so it doesn't rattle out, do it. I've had cases where the motor set screw can vibrate as you're shooting, and your motor will start backing off and try to start stripping, and then you'll have to go back off the field and adjust that set screw back in. So super glue, whatever you want to do, just nothing permanent because it's an easy to strip thread. Usually they're cheaper materials. Next thing is, what do you do about piston setups? So a typical piston that I might see, I'm pretty sure this is out of a G&G, is you have this kind of cheaper plastic with almost a full plastic tooth and then one metal tooth at the end, which this one metal tooth is whenever the piston is all the way back and it's resting on that one tooth before it fires. So that's when it springs at full cock and it's ready to go. That you could be tempted to replace this with a full metal teeth rack. However, you're now putting the risk that what's going to give out first, your piston or your gear set. And the gear set is a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to replace than a piston. So typically what you want to look into is what they call a half rack. So you have the strength at the tail end for the spring, but you also have that initial kind of aware giveaway point, call it a fuse, if you will, that as these first teeth wear out first, they'll eventually strip and the gearbox will just when you pull the trigger, and then you know, okay, time to change out the piston. Because then you're not putting as much stress on the gearbox all the time, or the gear set, and instead you just replace this piston whenever it wears. That's a lot cheaper, a lot easier to swap out. On the top of the piston, from factory, you could have all sorts of options. G&G, I really like their porting. What it does is, as it compresses, the air is going through these ports and pushing the O-ring on the side against the cylinder walls to get a better seal. G&P, theirs is a lot more basic. It's something that's easy to clog if you use a thicker grease. So I recommend only using theirs with a spray silicone oil for lubing those. Speaking of which, don't use anything petroleum based. Usually easiest to just get yourself a can that's made specifically for airsoft, that is a more natural silicone oil that doesn't have any petroleum in it, because petroleum based will eat away your O-rings over time and polymers. So they're not great at anything airsoft related. So you'll want to get yourself a non-petroleum lubricant. As far as cylinder heads, again, cheap setups. They'll typically have these plastic heads with a metal nozzle seated inside of it. These typically leak really bad and you're losing FPS with them. So an upgrade you may have is a full metal cylinder head. Granted, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this one out of here. But this is the new GMP stock internal. I pulled this out of the Strike Edition, Strike Industries Edition AEG that I now have an HPA into. Now these are typically full metal combined with the nozzle, and these will not leak. These are very, very efficient sealed. So after that, you just have to make sure you have a good nozzle, which I'm surprised GMP's using this nozzle. I would still recommend something like a retro arm CNC setup and get it with, like, I think it's a 21 millimeter length. That's usually the best seal for most AEGs, especially with the SHS hop-up chamber. It's a good length, it's 21 mil. Cylinders, you can bore it up if you like, but I've never really found a use of it. It's not something worth spending the money on. So I would say make sure you have a good seal with the piston head with proper porting, and a good cylinder head with good seal, and then an air nozzle that's the correct length for reaching into your hop-up chamber. Once you have those dialed, don't mess with anything else. That's all you need. Leave it all alone. If you find that you don't have enough FPS, time to look at springs. M120, that typically gets a 10-inch long setup, such as this blue gun here, to about 365, 375 FPS. If you have a longer setup with a longer inner barrel, it'll get you closer to that 400, and at that point, you're not going to be able to get a spring to close that 20 FPS gap. The M130 above this is too great of a spring rate change, and it'll throw you up around 420 FPS, so you're in this awkward midpoint between the 400 limit of assault and 450 limit of DMR. So if you're going to go for the assault class, which I'm recommending in this segment, is M120 spring and a good seal and rocket. You may not get perfect 400 FPS, but it will, without a doubt, be perfectly competitive out on the field. You will have a load of fun without spending a ton of money. So, to recap on it, the piston, you can, whenever it does the stock one eventually strip, you can go to a half rack. But I wouldn't go out of my way to upgrade that until the first one failed. And then while you're in there replacing that piston, that's when you want to look at, okay, do I want to change out the cylinder head for a better seal and a different piston head for better porting? And then nozzle length, I would do the nozzle length at the same time that you're doing the hop-up chamber. Just plan on, when you buy the hop-up chamber, that it's not going to be the right length for your stock nozzle to reach. That, especially in G&G combat machines, usually those definitely need the longer nozzle to seal. Okay. So for this next segment, talking about gear. Now, there's only a few things I really want to point out on this front, because really you're going to pick out a loadout that you feel best suits your personality. But as far as gameplay, this is where I'm going to get into. For the first thing, you've just gotten in the match, you have your mags, going through the first mag, you run out. Well, while these pouches are really nice for just keeping them on you for rather cheap, there's a problem. When you go to reload, you have to unvelcro with one hand, pull out your mag, get your old mag out, load the new one, put the old mag back in the pouch, and then velcro close. And again, all one-handed. So in this arrangement, I have my mags in what are called, I guess, kind of shell mag holders, if you will. I don't know if there's a better term for it. One of the older ones I used to be using is these matrix hard shells that are pretty cheap for like $10. The only issue is the rubber grips that go on the inside in order to keep the mag from falling out. You can lose them easy. They sell them after, like, as replacements, but they are easy to lose, and it's kind of annoying whenever your mags can start falling out without you noticing. So right now, I think of these are on the ESS Tech mag styles, where they still have the inserts hard shell, but I can pull out the mag. Here, let me give a better example. So I'm out of ammo, right? Mag's empty. I can pull it out, and then take one mag out, load it, take the old mag, tuck it right back in. Granted, these are brand new, I'm still breaking them in, so they're not as fast as I was with these whenever I got them broken in. But the whole idea of being able to have your mag ready to go, pull it out, one-handed, get the arm going, and notice how the way I set myself up, my mags are always so that a left hand can pull them out and be ready to go in. I don't have to fiddle with which orientation that these are facing. So having a quick mag setup can keep you in the fight much quicker with much less downtime compared to a pouch, which I'm just going to mock holding in a pouch on my belt here. So if I have the same mag in my pouch, alright, I just ran out, gun's empty. Okay, so now I have to pull this sucker out, rip it open, get it out, put the other one, unvelcro, shove her in, make sure it doesn't fall out again. It's not too terrible whenever you're standing up, but say you're laying on the ground and you're having to fiddle around, where is my strap, okay, make sure it doesn't close back up, so now I gotta reopen it again, put the mag in. It's very slow. So from a competitive standpoint, even if you have to go with the cheap boys, I'm recommending cheap boys over the pouches, all for the sake of quick reloads. Now, a similar concept to that is holsters. If you go with a custom pistol as your sidearm, you're going to have to deal with the fact you're going to have these real clunky snap button cloth universal holsters that they're not necessarily a fast pull it out and keep going with the fight. So if you can pick something standard like, boy, these Elite Force 1911s, these things are tanks, and they sell rebuild kits for keeping them going. They're a little heavy and they got a hell of a kick to them because of the metal slide and a lot of gas they use. But these suckers, I mean, this thing's been going, gosh, 6 years now, still going to fight. But what I'm getting at here is a universal setup that has a hard shell holster available to it. That's nothing to put it in, click the button, and you're already ready to go. You're not fiddling with your holster in order to have your back whenever you're in a pinch, especially for DMRs and bolt action stuff. I don't think there's too much of a price difference between the cloth and the hard shells, so if you can choose a sidearm that can work with a hard shell holster, I'll recommend that every day if that's going to be your backup. Granted, if you're going to the fight and it's your primary for however rig you got going on, for Speedsoft or just indoor CV in general, those you can pick whatever you like, and that's where I don't have too much complaint running the G&G MTP9 with the claw setup, because I'm not using that as my trusty in a pinch situation. Now, if you want to be light, they do have smaller belts for smaller pouches, such as for the sniper class. Like, this is what I have going on for me. These are Navrage's pouches for his SSG 96, and I'm using them for my Action Army L96. So that way I'm keeping my loadout light and just bringing the necessities with me into battle. So don't have to look at these super like loaded out vests whenever all you really need to do is go into the fight to have your ammo in a way that you can quickly reload and stay in the fight. Don't have to overdo it. Yeah, keep it simple. Take your ammo in the fight, be good to go, quick reloads, quick sidearm, and that's all you really need to get into it. I would say if you're going to pick gear for getting a custom loadout, try not to pick a loadout where you're going to have a hard time calling your hits, because it is airsoft. It's not paintball where we're going to have a big shiny piece of pink paint on your new vest to say that you got hit. Try to pick something that, like what I use is the neoprene vest, that whenever I get shot, it's very, very loud. And I can audibly immediately say, yeah, I'm hit, I'm out. I don't want to be that guy where I have this big hunky vest with millions of pouches on it, that if a BB clips it, I have no clue. I'm barely able to notice that scenario. So try to focus your loadout on being able to play fair and play fast. And do that, and I think you'll have